Alright, welcome back to Wrestling Retold and Relived with Richie Mars. I, of course, am your host, Richie Mars. I hope everyone had a fantastic weekend. We celebrated a couple of holidays, and this is being recorded before Monday Night Raw, but I'm sure as I will congratulate our topic for today, Seth Rollins, on another successful World Heavyweight Championship defense on Monday Night Raw, and later on tonight, he will defend it once again against Braun Breaker at NXT. Man, he has been all over the place defending this World Heavyweight Championship, which leads us to today's topic of clearing the vision of Seth Rollins. And I'm not talking about the abundant amount of matches that he had in WWE. I'm talking about the personas he carried, from the Authority to the Shield to the Kingslayer, Beast Slayer, Monday Night Messiah, the highs, the lows, what pretty much halted some momentum that he might have had during that time, and how he did to bring it back, because Seth Rollins' career has been many highs and many lows, as I'm going to get to right now. But before we do that, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And again, you can always follow us at Retold Richie Mars on Twitter, on Instagram, and TikTok for exclusive content. So check that out if you so choose. So as we all know, it's been repeated over the years many, many times before. Seth Rollins came in with the trio faction known as the Shield, with Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose, now known as Jon Moxley. You might have heard of them. They're only taking over the wrestling world by storm as of late. From there, they dominated the entire roster, from Daniel Bryan to John Cena to Randy Orton to Sheamus to Big Show, you named it, and they beat them up with no remorse. From there, it was clear that the directions were going to be different for each and every one of them, with Roman obviously being groomed for that top position of the company where he is now, and Dean Ambrose, Jon Moxley, everyone assumed that he would be the one who would turn heel on everybody. He would just go crazy because he was the lunatic fringe and just betray both of them. But in a cruel twist of fate, Seth Rollins was actually the Authority, which was a faction headed by Triple H, and disrupted the Shield. He became the sellout, he became the sniveling suck-up to the Authority, who basically handed him every opportunity from then on out, from Money in the Bank to high-profile matches to being the leader of Team Authority at Survivor Series. Seth Rollins was being positioned as the number one bad guy. From there, he did the heist of the century, WrestleMania 31, cashed in during the Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar match, and stole the WWE Championship, and had a fairly sized run with the title, which leads me to what I like to call first champion syndrome in WWE. Chances are, if you are a champion getting a shot at the WWE Championship and getting a lengthy run at it, you're not going to be booked the strongest. Take a look at Kurt Angle's first run, take a look at The Miz's first run, just as prime examples. If you are a heel, you're not going to have a glaring win-loss ratio. Even look at Kevin Owens when he was Universal Champion. It's not an impressive run on paper, and I think that's why so many people fall off the main event scene, because it's kind of like a test run. It's like, we're going with you as the quarterback, but you're going to get benched next season. It's just what it is in the landscape of WWE. Unfortunately, his run gets cut short as WWE Champion. He injured himself on a live event tour overseas and had to vacate the championship, but the rumors at the time were he was about to drop the championship to Roman Reigns at Survivor Series that year anyway, so this pretty much pushed forward him dropping the championship. He missed that year's WrestleMania, and then he came back shockingly as a heel, a bad guy. And this was at a time where if you had a long layoff, and I'm going to sidetrack right here, they also put out this really good 24 documentary, this WWE 24 documentary on Seth Rollins, and they did like a video diary on his recovery. He seemed like a very likable guy during the whole process, and he seemed like positive during it. And then there were some frustrations of trying to get in time to be back by WrestleMania, and you saw the highs and the lows of it. And they aired this the week after he returned. He attacked Roman Reigns after his match against AJ Styles, and usually logic would dictate that he would come back as a babyface and they would do like a double turn with Roman Reigns going to the path of villainy and Seth Rollins going the heroic route. But that didn't happen. Instead, they decided to keep Seth Rollins as a bad guy when the crowd so desperately wanted him to be that heroic man who took down the golden child of Roman Reigns. The story was right there, but that wasn't the plan at the time. So you can count that as missed opportunity number one on having Seth Rollins be at a higher position in WWE than he was. So the match at Money in the Bank happens in 2016, I believe, where Seth Rollins shockingly pinned Roman Reigns, where this was Roman Reigns in his Super Cena era, his Hulk Hogan era, and he didn't get pinned cleanly very often. It was then noted that Roman Reigns had failed a drug test, I believe it was for Adderall that he got popped for, but don't quote me on that. And the decision was Seth Rollins to win the WWE Championship, and then Dean Ambrose, Jon Moxley, comes in and cashes in his newly won Money in the Bank briefcase to dethrone Seth Rollins, his years-long rival, to win the WWE Championship for the first time, which was a perfect way to give closure to that whole Shield storyline. And all three members of the Shield were WWE Champion at the same time, which was a very pivotal point in WWE in that this is the changing of the guard that we were anticipating. These three new stars, whether it's in WWE or outside WWE, they were going to take over the wrestling industry as we knew it. From there, Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns were drafted to Raw, Dean on SmackDown. So now Rollins is still the main antagonist of the Monday Night Raw show until Triple H betrays him in a Fatal 4-Way Universal Championship match, which was won by Kevin Owens. I didn't like how this went down, and I'm sure there were many people who didn't like how this went down, and I'll tell you why. When you're the guy who is associated with the number one heel faction in the company at this point, being the Authority, and the Authority was kind of disbanded at this point, but Triple H and Stephanie McMahon were still the lead Authority figure antagonists of the show. You want to see that number one heel active wrestler who's leading that charge to break away on his own. You never want to be the one who has the tables turned on you. And what this showed was Seth Rollins was falling victim to Triple H and was indirectly in the fans' eyes was showed to be kind of like a petulant child because he was saying, oh, Triple H screwed me on the championship, he screwed me like this, where a normal babyface good guy would be like, all right, he got me good, but I'm going to leave you before you say I'm done. So that really did cool off Seth Rollins' momentum at that time. And another thing that was cooling off his momentum was the banning of his finishing move. As you all know, he used the curb stomp for a while, but right after he won the WWE Championship at WrestleMania 31, he switched to the pedigree to show his full allegiance of the Authority. And with all that happening and showing his allegiance, people didn't miss the stomp because it was sudden, it was from out of nowhere, there was less of a setup, and it just looked cool. It just felt right that Seth Rollins had the curb stomp as his finishing move. The tale is that the curb stomp to Vince McMahon's eyes looked too cruel and brutal, and that's why Seth Rollins switched to the pedigree. So Seth Rollins slowly but surely starts gaining some momentum again ahead of his match with Triple H at WrestleMania 33. And it was quite a scare, too, because I think he injured his knee on Raw, and there was a chance he could miss WrestleMania. But luckily, it wasn't hurt that bad that he had to miss the show. And I think they turned it into an unsanctioned match, so they had a lot of elements to play with, just in case he couldn't wrestle a normal match. And then Triple H falls to Seth Rollins' own pedigree, which ends Seth Rollins' association with the Authority for good. And then it seemed like Seth Rollins' momentum kind of like was at a standstill. He was kind of like in the middle of the card. I remember he was feuding with Bray Wyatt for a while. He switched his finisher not from a pedigree because he already did that to Triple H and his association, and he switched to the ripcord knee, which doesn't have the same visual appeal or impact as the curb stomp once did. So throughout the year, Seth Rollins was kind of like in this weird limbo where you wanted to see him succeed higher and higher, but Roman and Lesnar were kind of jockeying for position in that top spot of the card, which led to Seth Rollins teaming up with Dean Ambrose, which I thought was a fantastic come together with these two individuals, where Dean was not trusting of Rollins because of what happened when Rollins broke up the Shield, and Seth Rollins was trying to apologize for all that. Dean wasn't trusting him, and because, again, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. What was it? Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. That's the saying. Almost screwed that up there. Anyways, so Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose are in the tag team division, and they win the tag titles from The Bar, Cesaro and Sheamus, which were a very fun series of matches. But we were in this purgatory in tag team wrestling during this time where each brand, if we're lucky, would have two really great tag teams put on great matches, and it seemed like every other week we were either getting the same tag match or the same combination of tag matches, and it just wouldn't stop. It felt like Groundhog Day in the tag team division, and to some extent, that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like to a certain extent currently. Hopefully that changes with Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens as tag team champions, but I digress. So the whole focus of Rollins was the tag team division, his friendship with Dean, and I'm going to be blunt here, trying to make Roman look cool, because at the time Roman wasn't the coolest guy around at that point. And then we finally get to Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins dropping the tag team championships, and what I think is a turning point for Seth Rollins. It was said in the book Creating the Mania of WrestleMania, where they chronologically went through the days of creative that they were planning for WrestleMania 34, which featured ideas such as Kurt Angle versus Jason Jordan, if Shane couldn't come to WrestleMania because he was in a helicopter accident and I think he had like diverticulitis, he was going to be replaced by either Dolph Ziggler or Chris Jericho. And there was another match on that card, which was Dean Ambrose versus Seth Rollins, which would be the long-awaited heel turn of Dean Ambrose to give him a fresh new line of creativity. But we're going to get to that Dean Ambrose heel turn, don't you worry. And this was a turning point for Seth Rollins, because he cut this promo with Kurt Angle, who was the general manager of Raw at the time. And he said, I miss the old Seth Rollins. I want to prove that I could be Seth Freakin Rollins. And that's where, I think this was around the time where the Seth Freakin Rollins thing became his moniker. And with that, Seth got pretty much almost all his mojo back instantaneously. The fans were behind him. He got the curb stomp back, which he surprised everyone. I think, ironically, he used it the first time again against Finn Balor, who he's facing at Money in the Bank in a couple weeks from now. Seth had that momentum of the fans choosing they wanted Seth to be the guy on Raw. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So, as Seth Rollins would tell Steve Austin on the Broken Skull Sessions, that he went to Vince and he said, give me the Intercontinental Championship and let me show you what I can do. So he opens WrestleMania 34, has a fantastic match with The Miz and Finn Balor in a triple threat match to win the Intercontinental Championship. This is a sidebar, but fun fact, there was a plan in place for Finn Balor to face Kane as the Demon for that WrestleMania, which is why on Raw a couple weeks prior to WrestleMania 34, Kane just randomly just beat Finn Balor. And that was going to be a setup for WrestleMania 34. Again, it's one of those things where, it would have been cool to see Demon Finn against Kane, but I think they made the right choice, at least match quality-wise. Which leads us to my least favorite wrestling trope, at least currently. The open challenge. Everyone's got an open challenge. You have a title and you have nothing creatively? Open challenge. You have nothing to do on the show and you want to fill in some time? Open challenge. So what exactly is an open challenge? Basically, a wrestler would be in the ring and said, anyone who wants a shot at my title, you got it. But instead of the logical thing, and you have all these wrestlers just running and running and running, just beating each other up like they did in NXT with Wesley's North American Championship Open Challenges, you have one wrestler hand the audio guy his CD, say, hey, play my music. And then we see only one wrestler come out for the Open Challenge. It does kind of make the rest of the roster look dumb in these Open Challenges because if your title is so wanted and coveted, you kind of want to get in there as quickly as possible. But yeah, Seth Rollins was putting on some bangers for the Intercontinental Championship. He had a really good match at Backlash against The Miz. That match made the show worth watching, and it kicked off the show, so after you watched it, you could turn the rest off. That match was infamous for the Roman Reigns and Samoa Joe main event, where there was a shot of the crowd after Roman won that the audience was just leaving. They were just leaving either to beat traffic or they didn't want to see Roman celebrate. But this was during that awkward time where Roman was still in the big dog character, and he wasn't given much to work with other than, I'm the big dog and I'm going to be the champion. But meanwhile, while that was going on, Seth Rollins was carrying the Intercontinental Championship and bringing prestige to a championship that only few have during the 2010 era, like The Miz, like Dolph Ziggler. Which leads us to Seth Rollins and Dolph Ziggler's feud for the Intercontinental Championship. And this is where there's a first nail in the coffin for this iteration of Seth Rollins begins, in my opinion at least. And it's nothing that happened bad in the ring. It was just how it happened. So, how the story starts, Dolph Ziggler beats Seth Rollins for the Intercontinental Championship with the help of Drew McIntyre. And they go through a long, long feud. So long that it goes into the fall. So we're in the springtime, summertime, we're going all the way to pretty much the end of the fall. And an opportunity comes where it's Dolph Ziggler defending the Intercontinental Championship against Seth Rollins in a 30-minute Iron Man match. Sounds great on paper, right? Except there was the clock on the board of the Titantron, on the LED board, so all the fans could see the clock counting down. And as the clock was counting down, the crowd decided it was a Royal Rumble match, and we're making like the sounds every time it would hit zero. And you could even hear during the match where they take the clock off and they boo and they're booing. They're not paying attention to the match. And you hear Dolph Ziggler on the hot mic saying, oh, they shouldn't have taken the clock off. or something to that effect. And then they finally had the clock put back on, and everyone was cheering, "Yay!" It was just ridiculous. It's one of those times where wrestling fans hijack the show, makes it unfun for the viewing audience. At least they're having fun, but at the expense of everybody watching. Again, you pay your ticket, you can do whatever you want. But don't be surprised on the rewatch to everybody else watching the show. It's not going to translate well, and it's going to put the heat on the other two guys for not having a good enough match, even though the crowd wasn't cooperating. We saw matches where there was no crowd at all, and those were hard to get through. Now imagine if the crowd wasn't cooperating during your match and completely turning and poo-pooing your match. It's just ridiculous. But the 2-on-1 attacks are going to cease from Dolph Ziggler and Drew McIntyre against Seth Rollins because Dean Ambrose is back, and he is looking swole. And as Dean Ambrose told Talk is Jericho, he didn't like how this return was phrased because they kind of were a little hokey with the build-up, and he wanted it to be more of a surprise pop rather than, hey, let's give them an opportunity to guess who's going to be in Seth Rollins' corner. But in realistic and honestly, everybody was expecting Dean Ambrose to be in Seth Rollins' corner, which Seth Rollins wins the Intercontinental Championship at SummerSlam against Dolph Ziggler. And Seth Rollins and Dolph have always had solid matches with each other. I think at this time, the Dolph Ziggler character, even with the fresh coat of paint with the Drew McIntyre partnership, was so meh. Because when he turned heel during that SmackDown 2016 era, he had a lot of momentum rebuilt with his feud with The Miz and some rub with his feud with Dean Ambrose, which unfortunately fell very flat to the SummerSlam crowd in 2016, that it was almost hard to get excited for Dolph getting this opportunity because we all knew the rug was going to be pulled out from under him. And then after this would be done, he would be relegated to either not showing up on TV or not being a part of anything as meaningful, which turns out to be true. That's kind of what happens at this point. So even though he's the Intercontinental Champion, Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose team up against Drew McIntyre and Dolph Ziggler, who are the tag champs that's at this point at Hell in a Cell. Fantastic tag match. And during this time, the Shield is reunited. They reunited the end of the Raw after SummerSlam. And they go on quite a I don't even think it was like a good run, but it was like, it's a Shield reunion, so people are going to pop for it regardless. Unfortunately, during this time, Roman Reigns announces his leukemia has returned, and on that show, and they gave it up to the performers whether or not to go through with the turn of Dean Ambrose turning on Seth Rollins during the night because the night was so heavy. So Dean Ambrose turns heel on Seth Rollins, and this is where the second nail in the coffin comes from this iteration of the Seth Rollins character. Because you have, on paper, what should be a classic rivalry of Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins. Unfortunately, when you're in a pay-per-view called TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs, and this feud has gotten so personal because of their fighting is so emotional because their friend is out of commission due to a very real-life illness, and they're not really going to, street fight. They start off with a headlock, which is fine if you want a wrestling match. And this is Dean Ambrose's first heel character in WWE that we're seeing. But if you say all this bad blood to each other, these are these guys who were once brothers, and you just want to see them fight. It's like you don't want to see them fight, but you want to see them hash it out because there were so many things that were so personal. Dean Ambrose burned his Shield vest, and it was just a slog to get through because you're at a show which promises to be no holds barred, no rules. And I think it was half of WWE advertising that this might be a stipulation match, and half the crowd being disinterested and this is just a normal wrestling match with restrictions on it. That's how I viewed it, at least. And unfortunately, it didn't really do much to save the feud of Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose. And which led to Seth Rollins, even though he lost the Intercontinental Championship, he immediately became the front runner to win the Royal Rumble that year, which he did. But the momentum wasn't really on his side, because once you go to a garbage feud, not in any fault of the performers at all, just the material they were given at that time, and then you're like, oh, this guy's going to be number one contender for one of the most prestigious prizes in professional wrestling, it's a hard transition to make. And I think Seth Rollins, you had to kind of build him from the ground up again. But fortunately, Roman Reigns announced he was in remission, which means we got one more Shield reunion before Dean Ambrose's contract is up. So they do one more Shield reunion. Seth Rollins wins the Universal Championship at WrestleMania 35. Almost passes out on stage. He tells the story before that he was so hopped up on adrenaline just from the crowd and the atmosphere that he almost face planted on the stage. You could see it in the video too. It's just crazy to watch that one of his biggest achievements could have turned out so much differently than it became. So, Seth Rollins' Universal Championship run. This is his first attempt of being the guy on Monday Night Raw. And it was hindered by a lot of different variables. If you heard my Kofi Mania episode in the archives, you would know that I am not a fan of the wild card rule. I don't know anyone who is the fan of the wild card rule. And the wild card rule is between Raw and SmackDown, and there are 4 participants from each show that can show up on the other show at any given time. And that just kind of muddies the waters on who's going to be a contender for Seth Rollins' championship. And he does have a fantastic defense against AJ Styles at that year's Money in the Bank. And then enter Constable Baron Corbin. Whew, boy. For those of you who don't remember Constable Baron Corbin, first off, I envy you. Second off, he's coming off the biggest victory of his career up to this point, and ever, in that he retired Kurt Angle at WrestleMania 35 in Kurt Angle's last match. And now he is the number one contender for Seth Rollins' Universal Championship. And it just wasn't... I don't even just want to say it wasn't good. It was just... the character of Constable Baron Corbin was so much one note. There was no diversity. He was just a bad guy in a suit. And it was just... I can't remember one thing of that entire feud, of the TV build-up to this feud. And they had 3 pay-per-view matches. The only things I remember are what happened at the pay-per-view. One where Seth Rollins gets saved by his wife, Becky Lynch, against Lacey Evans, because Lacey was the special guest referee, I think. And then Brock tried to cash in on him at like one of the... I think it was like the Super Showdown show in Saudi Arabia. And then Brock Lesnar cashed in at the end of the mixed tag match where Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch were teaming together and defending their titles together. Notice how all of that didn't include Baron Corbin. And again, it's no fault of his own. It's just the material they were given just wasn't that strong as a main event program. Something that I did find interesting during that time was when Brock was Mr. Money in the Bank, carrying around like a boombox. And Kofi and Seth Rollins, because of the wild card rule, they would come on each other's shows, and Brock would be taunting them. And I thought it was pretty cool that Brock Lesnar was just taunting both Kofi and Rollins and Kofi were just kind of backing each other up, just trying to like thwart off this beast who has this crazy advantage that he could cash in on at any time. And Brock eventually does cash in on Seth Rollins, wins the Universal Championship, and a lot of people were booing Seth Rollins during this time. Mostly because since this was his first time, his first opportunity to be the guy in charge of WWE, he was kind of acting, I don't want to say arrogant, but his Twitter, he was the number one guy waving the WWE flag, which is fine. You should be happy and proud of the company that you work for. But he had a Twitter spat with Will Ospreay, who was in New Japan at the time, I believe. And Seth Rollins and him were going at it. They were throwing jabs and barbs at each other. But then Seth Rollins brought out the I make more money than you ploy, which does not look good on the wrestling fans, because the wrestling fans are fans of people who enjoy and love the craft. Once you bring up money involved in that conversation, that defeats the purpose of wrestling being fun. It just, because you're just bragging, you're making more money, and you don't care about the art. That's what it was coming across. And Seth Rollins was getting booed. I think there was a hashtag, Seth is not cool, or Seth Rollins isn't cool. That was trending, and Seth Rollins was playing it up a little bit. But a lot of people were just booing, and it took a while for Seth Rollins to have his image rehabbed. And it was luckily that Brock Lesnar was not hated by the fan base, but everyone was sick and tired of him being undisputed champion, that they allowed him to give him like one more chance. Like, all right, we'll give you one more shot as Universal Champion. And he wins it at SummerSlam. And then, whew boy, we get to the Fiend. Oh, the Fiend. So Seth Rollins, in the interim, wins the tag team titles with Braun Strowman, defends the titles, the tag team and the Universal Championship at the Night of Champions pay-per-view against Strowman, and they drop their tag team titles. And then the Fiend, who debuted at SummerSlam, who was Bray Wyatt, basically choked out Seth Rollins, and instantly, right away, gets a championship opportunity, which confused me personally, because you debut a new character that was received very well by the fan base, and then immediately, we gotta keep it hot, let's put him on the top storyline, let's give him the world title. And then me and my brain, I'm just like, oh no, why should the Fiend care about the championship? You know, shouldn't we build the Fiend up as not caring about other people saying? Like, the Fiend had one match at SummerSlam against Balor, very dominant win, but it was against Finn Balor, who was getting written off of TV anyway. And the Fiend didn't really have a feud in that interim, and then all of a sudden he attacks the top dog. Once you go for the top dog, after you win or after that feud, where do you go from there? You could only go down from there unless you're feuding with someone like a Cena or a Rock Caliber, and the Fiend wasn't getting that just quite yet. And the Fiend character and the Funhouse Bray Wyatt character wasn't given much to work with or interact with. And even Seth Rollins, quote-unquote, burned down the Firefly Funhouse during that whole feud. But the simple fact was, the Fiend was different and cool. And Seth Rollins was still doing the same song and dance that he was doing a year, 2 years, 3 years prior. So if you're not on the pulse of your character, and it becomes repetitive, it becomes a slog to get through, and there was no more development. The only development that Seth Rollins got during that time was he kept screaming in the corner when the Fiend would appear, which is not how you should portray your top champion on Raw, being terrified of the Fiend. You should be, like, standing up to him. Like, you could show, like, some fear, like, but it shouldn't be, like, that over the top, like, screaming and quivering in the corner. Like, you could have him, like, back away and being, like, confused and concerned that this man has completely lost his mind, but you can't just full on have just a panic attack of this monster just, like, tearing up from the ring. It just doesn't make your champion look strong. And then we get to their match at Hell in a Cell, inside the Hell in a Cell match. I want to find the person that thought it was a good idea to not only keep the red Hell in a Cell, because the Hell in a Cell is of red chain link lining, but to keep the Fiend's red lighting on during the whole match. It didn't need it. It hurt my eyes, and it was bad. And the match was even worse, if you believe it. It completely... In wrestling, there's only so much suspension of disbelief that I can get. When Seth Rollins hits a curb stomp on his other opponents, maybe 1, 2, 3 max, he hits in a match. This man hit the curb stomp at least 8 to 10 times during this entire match, and the Fiend kept getting up. And how does this match end? How does this Hell in a Cell match that ends by pinfall and submission only, it ends with Seth Rollins dumping the entire stuff under the ring on top of the Fiend, having a sledgehammer, the referee saying, "No, you're better than this." Seth hits the Fiend on top of the head with the sledgehammer, and then the ref rings the bell. It's a no contest. Make it make sense, please. Like, I shouldn't take it as seriously as I do, but these are the rules that they implant in their own match type, and they're not following their own rules. And it's confusing, and it hurts me. Intelligence. We need intelligence. Anyway, what's even worse about it is Seth is looking over the Fiend's corpus, I guess, his corpse, not his Corpus Christi, it's corpse. And the Fiend wakes up, and he starts choking out Seth Rollins with the mandible claw, and Seth is spitting up blood. And it was the worst thing, the worst pay-per-view ending I remember seeing in life. And as the story goes, Seth Rollins was staring a hole at Vince McMahon. They were staring back and forth with each other. Vince leaves to get up, and Tyson Kidd had to restrain Seth Rollins. They later squashed it the next day, saying, "Hey, we gotta hash this out because this is ridiculous." Which is the beginning of the Seth Rollins Messiah character, which I was a really big fan of, and I wish we got more of it, but unfortunately, things like the pandemic and injuries halted his entire faction of what it could be. So where do we start? So the Authors of Pain were a tag team that was written off, and now they're being repackaged. Kind of like some like headhunter, like hitmen sort of characters. It was a really cool vibe. And Seth Rollins was continuing to get booed because he was this delusional guy who thought he was the face of Raw, but no one wanted him to be the face of Raw. Kevin Owens accuses Seth Rollins of being in cahoots with the Authors of Pain. And Seth Rollins says, "No, I'm not." Turns out later that night in the show, he is. And which leads us to the Monday Night Messiah character, where Seth Rollins is trying to purify Raw of all its misdeeds. He recruits Buddy Murphy, who's now Buddy Matthews in AEW, as one of his disciples, and it was a pretty cool-looking faction, all things considered. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened, and then I think it was Razor, not Akam, who got an injury, so they were written off TV because you can't have one without the other. That's the WWE way whenever there's a brother tag team or tag team in general. Once one is injured, you can't use the other one. So all that happened. He gained a new disciple in Austin Theory during the pandemic era with no fans, only like the NXT crowd was there. The NXT wrestlers were forming the crowd in the pandemic era. But I have a theory. I'm going to go a little bit forward in time, but this is my theory because as it turns out, the Monday Night Messiah character only feuded with 3 people during his entire run, which was about a year and a half. And it was Kevin Owens, who we lost to at WrestleMania. Had the sick white gear too. He looked like the White Tiger Power Ranger. It was awesome. Drew McIntyre for a spell when he first won the WWE Championship, and then Rey Mysterio for legitimately from July to November. That's how long this feud lasted. And it went across 2 shows and went across Raw and SmackDown because all of them got drafted because they wanted more soap opera stuff on SmackDown. And it was beating a dead horse. But I have a theory. I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on because the ending of this feud was Murphy, Seth Rollins' lead disciple, fell in love with Rey Mysterio's daughter, Aaliyah, even though I think there's like a 15-year age difference between the two. And I think the reason for that was instead of Murphy, I believe Austin Theory was the one who was being groomed for that spot because just the age difference kind of makes sense, and Austin Theory is the younger of all 3 of the members involved. So I thought that spot was originally thought of for Theory, but Austin Theory got written off TV. I believe there were like some allegations against him, and later those were proven not to be the case against them, and then he was allowed back on TV. At least their internal investigation. So Murphy fell in love with Rey Mysterio's daughter, Aaliyah. They get together. Rey Mysterio accepts Murphy into his family and is never mentioned again. I think they have like 1 or 2 matches together, and then Murphy is written off TV because WWE wasn't interested in advertising Buddy Murphy. It's just like it's like months and months of this payoff, and then nothing happens. And Seth Rollins even like removed Rey Mysterio's eye in a match. It was the eye for the eye match, and the finish was whoever can remove the other person's eye in the match wins the match. And Seth Rollins shoved Rey Mysterio's eye in the steel steps. His eye popped out. It was a really weird effect. It looked like one of those gummy eyeballs that you would get for Halloween. Seth Rollins threw up. Very great. You know what? I can see why people don't like the Messiah character. Because if I was associated with a match where you had to mutilate your person's eyesight, yeah, I wouldn't like that either. Maybe it's just me. Everyone else is right. Okay, so Seth Rollins takes some time off because Becky Lynch is due to give birth, and then he comes back as the Visionary, which is right now kind of like a hybrid of his Messiah character. He's now the SmackDown Savior because he got drafted to SmackDown, and now he is the Visionary. And that's where the start of his theme, his catchy theme comes from. You know, the whoa, whoa. I think I might play some music in the beginning. I'm not sure yet. We have time. Let's see if my editing skills are up to par. So now Seth Rollins is the Visionary, and he had a critically acclaimed feud with Edge, a feud that was years and years in the making, believe it or not, because there was a time when the Authority wasn't on television, and Seth Rollins won the Authority back, and he threatened to break Edge's neck again. It was a very cool segment on Raw. And then you realize the Authority is coming back, and you're like, oh no. The coolness factor kind of like dropped off from there. But now Seth Rollins is the Visionary, and now he dresses in over-the-top mink coats and clothing, and just trying to play that character who thinks he's all that hype and then some. Which later transitions to his feud with Cody Rhodes, and that's where we are kind of like in present day of his character evolving from that delusional character he was to start off with the Monday Night Messiah, which leads to present day that he is now more than a god in his eyes. He just is. He is him, not Carmelo Hayes. Seth Rollins is him in the WWE, which leads us to his World Heavyweight Championship. The first ever WWE World Heavyweight Championship in this belt's incarnation's history. And he's getting that chance again to run with that ball like he did with the Intercontinental Championship with the constant open challenges. Even though it's not my favorite, but they're actually telling stories in between his open challenges. So hopefully he gets a very solid run with some memorable feuds to prove to everybody in WWE and in wrestling in general that he can carry feuds without being seemingly held back by certain things, whether it's his finisher getting taken away, whether it's these stories not being up to snuff with the Dean Ambrose, Jon Moxley situation of them getting restricted creatively, even if like the creative is bad, because there is no argument that Seth Rollins in ring is probably top 3 in the world easily. And now that he's getting a chance, and now he has all the characters put together, and he kind of fused all his previous incarnations into this one character of Seth Freakin Rollins, he has the highest chance of being the guy after Roman steps down, possibly. I really do believe that. If Seth Rollins wanted to focus more on wrestling and become that top guy, he can do that. But time will tell. But overall, what I think hurt Seth Rollins in the long run and delayed the inevitable of him being a top guy in WWE is his lack of a turn against Triple H from 2016 when he was still waving the authority flag, and then Triple H turned on him, because that stopped all momentum that Rollins had, because the crowds were still behind him. If there was no conflict with Seth Rollins and Triple H up to that point, and Triple H just randomly just turned on him, it's almost like Thanos punching Captain America in the face, and Captain America just stewing about it, saying, "Why did he punch me in the face? I don't get it." You know? It just doesn't make Seth Rollins look strong in that regard. That was an issue. Taking away his finisher that he made famous was an issue. That was something that separated him from the pack. And once he left the authority and stopped using the pedigree and used that ripcord knee, even though it was different, it didn't have the same impact visually and sound-wise, because you can make a ripcord knee devastating, but not as devastating as a curb stomp. And then he started building that momentum up again once they gave him the curb stomp, once they saw that he was putting in the work and he was going solo. And he cut that promo with Kurt Angle saying, "Man, we need Seth Freakin Rollins again to prove why he's the top guy on Monday Night Raw," and being that head guy on Monday Night Raw, and the crowd was behind him. And again, they defaulted to Roman Reigns being the guy, even though people wanted Seth Rollins. And that momentum kind of stalled more so with the Dean Ambrose feud that did no one any favors. And then the Brock Lesnar stuff happened. The long Baron Corbin stuff happened. Even with them teaming Rollins with his wife or fiance at the time. And them not having that great of on-screen chemistry. I think they said in the past that they weren't too thrilled about being paired up on TV together. And it was just Rollins trying to be that head guy of Monday Night Raw and kind of cracking under the pressure of being this guy who waves the WWE flag, but you see the creative they're putting out during that time, and you see how Seth is responding to criticism and to other wrestlers and other organizations that did impact his popularity for a while. And it wasn't until he was kind of stripped away of that Seth Rollins character that he had to rebuild himself up. Even though the Messiah character wasn't that great of a hit, those little aspects of grandiose and delusion really did help Seth Rollins become the Seth Rollins he is today, which is the visionary, the revolutionary Seth freaking Rollins. And now, since he's now the head guy on Raw, arguably, with Cody Rhodes, he can put in the work and prove that he can carry a show without anything controversial happening. So that was my tale of Seth Rollins, from the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. If you liked this podcast, please give us 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And again, you can follow me on @RetoldRichieMars on Twitter Instagram, and TikTok. I again am your host, Richie Mars. Thank you for spending some time with me talking shop about some wrestling. TTFN, ta-ta for now, and I will see you next time.